For weeks, perhaps months, the world had been an endless, heaving expanse of gray and green. The sun beat down, or the rain lashed, but always, the deck beneath their worn boots rolled with the ocean's unpredictable breath. The air they breathed was a constant stew of salt, tar, bilge, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of unwashed bodies and lingering disease. Sleep was a snatched, uneasy thing, punctuated by the ship's groans and the shriek of the wind in the rigging. Food was hardtack, salted meat, and a dwindling water ration that tasted of the cask it came from. Life was a relentless cycle of labor, hauling ropes, patching sails, swabbing decks, bailing water, all under the watchful, often brutal eye of the quartermaster or captain. Freedom was a word whispered on the wind, a distant memory, or a desperate hope. Then, a subtle shift. Not a sound, not a sight, but a change in the very character of the air. A damp, earthy richness began to subtly penetrate the pervasive tang of the sea. The gulls, usually solitary specks against the vastness, started to appear in greater numbers, their cries closer, more urgent. Whispers rippled through the crew like a sudden gust of wind through the sails. Land. The word, though unconfirmed, held more potency than any command. Hearts, long hardened by routine and deprivation, quickened. Eyes, squinting against the glare of the sea, now eagerly scanned the horizon, willing a dark line to appear. And then there it was, a low, smudged silhouette against the hazy blue, growing steadily clearer. The undulating curve of distant hills, the faint suggestion of trees. The ship, which had been a world unto itself, now seemed a mere vessel, carrying them home to something infinitely more substantial. An unspoken relief washed over the crew, a palpable loosening of the taut discipline that had bound them for so long. Even the captain's commands, usually sharp and unyielding, carried a note of anticipation. Ropes were coiled with renewed vigor, sails trimmed with an almost eager precision. The low rumble of the distant shore, a deep, resonant hum, began to penetrate the ceaseless roar of the waves. As they drew closer, the port unfurled before them. Not the grand, ordered docks of a major European city, but a bustling, chaotic sprawl of rough-hewn jetties and ramshackle buildings clinging to the water's edge. A tapestry of sound began to emerge. The shouts of stevedores, the creaking of other ships' timbers, the distant bray of a donkey, the piercing squawk of exotic birds, and faintly, the raucous, disjointed strains of music from some unseen tavern. The damp, earthy smell now mingled with the sharp tang of wood smoke, the acrid bite of cheap tobacco, and the cloying sweetness of fermenting fruit overwhelmed the sea's familiar scent. Bringing a ship, especially a pirate vessel, into a port like Nassau or Port Royal was no graceful ballet. It was a wrestling match against currents and tides, a chaotic symphony of shouted orders, groaning ropes, and the heavy thump of fenders against unforgiving pilings. The solid thud of the planks hitting the rough-hewn stone of the jetty sent a jolt through the ship, a jarring finality after months of ceaseless motion. And then, the gangplank. The first man down took an unsteady step, his sea legs still swaying to a phantom rhythm. Each man followed, feeling the dizzying sensation of firm, unyielding ground beneath his feet after months of rolling decks. It was a strange, almost disorienting freedom. The cacophony of the port, once a distant promise, now crashed over them. A torrent of human voices, animal calls, the clatter of carts, and the insistent rhythm of distant drums. After the isolated brutality of the ocean, the sheer, unbridled presence of so many other lives was an intoxicating, overwhelming rush. The promise of fleeting pleasures hangs heavy in the air, a potent lure after months of deprivation. But what awaited them in the taverns and alleys was a different kind of storm. The sheer, unbridled presence of so many other lives in port was an intoxicating, overwhelming rush, a current that pulled them not to their bunks for rest, but to the glowing windows of the nearest tavern, beckoning like a false dawn. Weeks, often months, of brutal routine, of thirst, hunger, fear, and the unyielding sway of the deck had distilled into a singular, ravenous craving for the opposite: abundance, stability, and forgetfulness. The moment they pushed through the rough timber doors, a new world, equally raw but wildly different, assaulted their senses. The air inside was a thick, cloying embrace of stale ale, cheap tobacco, and the unwashed warmth of too many bodies, a stench utterly alien to the salt and tar of the open sea. Over it all, the insistent, sweet tang of raw rum, burning hot, fought to dominate. A cacophony of drunken boasts, the splintering crash of a dropped tankard, the coarse strains of a fiddle struggling to be heard, and the high-pitched laughter of women mingled into a constant, boisterous roar. Shoulder to shoulder, the pirates pushed their way through the throng, their sea-hardened hands already fumbling for the coin they'd risked their lives for. They had plundered, raided, endured storms and privations beyond imagination to acquire it. And now, with astonishing speed, they would squander it. The first gulp of crude, potent rum was a searing fire down throats accustomed to only brackish water or watered grog. It burned, yes, but it also numbed, erasing the memory of the lash, the storm, the gnawing hunger that had become a constant companion. This was their release, their momentary liberation from the grim discipline of the ship. Every shout, every swig, every coarse joke was a defiance against the brutal routine of the sea, a temporary taste of the freedom they believed they fought for. Soon, the rough camaraderie extended to women, whose painted smiles promised fleeting warmth, their embraces a brief, expensive solace against the cold reality of their lives. For a few coins, a man could almost forget the emptiness of his future, the constant threat of the gallows, or the slow rot of disease that shadowed every crowded port. The heavy silver pieces, the doubloons, the pieces of 8, flowed across the scarred wood of the bar like water, buying rounds, buying laughter, buying forgetfulness. It was a binge, a desperate gulp of life after a forced drought, a frantic attempt to cram months of suppressed desire into a few days. They drank until their legs betrayed them, until their voices cracked, until the world spun in a dizzying haze of false joy. For a few brief hours, under the tavern's flickering lamps, they were kings, their coffers seemingly endless, their futures unclouded. They were alive, undeniably, vehemently alive, for the first time in what felt like forever. But every coin spent, every gulp of rum swallowed, peeled back another layer of the illusion of freedom. Beyond the tavern's haze, a darker, more insidious set of dangers lay in wait. Beyond the tavern's haze, a darker, more insidious set of dangers lay in wait. The port, a labyrinth of cobbled streets and shadowed alleys, offered not just pleasure, but peril with every step. The very air, thick with the scent of human toil and refuse, carried more than just the smell of foreign spices and cheap rum. It was often laced with the sickly sweet tang of fever, a silent, unseen predator, far more deadly than any cutlass. Yellow fever, smallpox, dysentery. These unseen terrors thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions, scything through sailors and citizens alike. A night of revelry could easily lead to a week of delirium, and often to a shallow grave. Many a pirate, having escaped the gallows and the shark, found their end coughing blood into a foul straw mattress, far from the sea they knew. But the city held human dangers too. The jostle of the crowd, the accidental bump, the wrong words spoken over a tankard. Any slight could erupt into a sudden, brutal brawl. The clang of a dropped tankard could quickly be followed by the flash of a hidden knife. These were not the regulated duels of gentlemen, but desperate, chaotic struggles where a broken bottle or a swiftly drawn dagger decided fates in the flickering light of a distant street lamp. A moment of drunken confidence could lead to a permanent silence, a quick, cold press of a blade against ribs in a forgotten alley. Loyalty, even among shipmates, often dissolved with enough rum and the lure of a reward. Informants whispered in shadowy corners, their words like poison, trading the whereabouts of a former comrade for a few pieces of silver or a pardon for their own misdeeds. Every stranger was a potential enemy, every familiar face a potential betrayer. The easy camaraderie of the sea often felt a world away, replaced by a gnawing suspicion that ate at the edges of their drunken joy. And then there were the authorities. Despite the illicit nature of some pirate havens, colonial governors and merchant captains were always looking to swell their ranks, legally or not. Press gangs roamed the docks, thick-necked men with cudgels and a complete disregard for due process. A lone pirate, staggering home after a night of excess, could find himself suddenly seized, dragged onto a waiting vessel, and forced back to sea under a king's flag, a fate many considered worse than death. The echoing shouts of a chase in the dead of night, The thud of heavy boots, the frantic thrum of a frightened heart. These were the sounds that replaced the raucous laughter of the tavern. Even in more friendly ports, a pirate's every move was watched, their every indulgence noted. A misstep, a public disturbance, a quarrel with a respectable citizen, and the shackles could be on their wrists, leading them not to another ship, but to a dank prison cell, awaiting a judge and the inevitable noose. The bitter taste of fear and suspicion became as common as the taste of rum, coating the back of the throat, reminding them that their freedom ashore was a precarious, fleeting thing. It was a constant dance on the edge of a blade, a razor's edge between fleeting pleasure and utter ruin. With each passing day, the city tightened its grip, turning fleeting pleasures into burdensome debts and trust into a dangerous gamble. The true cost of their liberty began to manifest not in lost gold, but in lost comrades and the chilling prospect of capture. The initial days ashore, a blur of rum and revelry, soon gave way to the sharp arithmetic of a dwindling purse. Each coin spent, once flung with reckless abandon, now earned a moment's pause, a fleeting calculation. The heavy, satisfying weight of a plunder-filled pouch grew lighter and fragile until its familiar jingle became a hollow, mocking echo. The initial roar of the tavern quieted, replaced by the hushed tones of negotiation, then pleading. Credit ran dry. The smiles of the tavern keepers curdled into scowls, and the easy camaraderie of the early days dissolved into the cold scrutiny of creditors. The pirate, once a fleeting king of his own domain, found himself chained, not by iron, but to the very ground he sought relief upon, entangled in a web of promissory notes and escalating debts. The fine clothes, once purchased with such swagger, became worn and soiled. The copious feasts of roasted meats and fresh bread vanished, replaced by the gnawing ache of hunger returning, a grim, familiar phantom. This deprivation, however, felt far more insidious than the ship's rations, for here, amidst plenty, it was a direct consequence of their own squandering. The thrill of freedom began to rot, leaving behind a bitter aftertaste. The casual glance of a dock worker or a passing merchant, once ignored, now held the potential for accusation, for the whispered word to the authorities. Every alley became a potential trap, every shadow a lurking danger. They were stranded, adrift on land, without the familiar planks beneath their feet, or the steadfast crewmates at their side. Their pockets empty, their options dwindling to a terrifying few. The dream of a new life, bought with stolen gold, evaporated into the harsh reality of colonial port economics. Without means, a pirate was nothing. A target for desperate thieves, a mark for impressment by a passing naval vessel, or worse, a man marked for the gallows. The bustling streets, once a symphony of life, now seemed to hum with the low, constant thrum of threat and a chilling sense of vulnerability. The cold sweat of realization began to bead on their brows, A chill that had nothing to do with the sea air, but with the chilling truth of their predicament. They were not free. They were trapped. Some, less fortunate or simply less careful, had already found their freedom curtailed in the grimmest way. Through the grimy, barred windows of the local jailhouse, one might catch a glimpse of a familiar face. A shipmate, once boisterous and brave, now a gaunt, broken figure, lost in the heavy silence of a jail cell. No more the salty air, no more the shared dangers, only the stink of stale straw and despair. Their pleas, when they could be heard, were the desperate, begging voices of men facing not merely a return to sea. The sight was a potent, visceral warning. This was the ultimate consequence of the land's false promise, the final destination of a squandered share. The shore, once a beacon of respite, had become a gilded cage, its promises now hollow. The horizon, once a symbol of endless journey, now beckoned as a necessary escape, away from the clutches of land and back to the predictable brutality of the sea. The call of the sea, muted by the din and distractions of land, grew louder with each passing, wasted day. It was not a siren song, but a low, persistent thrum, a summons back to duty, to the familiar brutality of a known world. The preparations for departure were a sullen affair, devoid of the boisterous energy that had marked their arrival. There was no joyous anticipation, only a profound, weary resignation. The last few coins, if any remained, were clutched and spent on a final hurried gulp of cheap, fiery rum, its fleeting burn doing little to quell the gnawing ache of the pervasive hangover that had become a constant, unwelcome companion. The city's promise of boundless indulgence had curdled into the bitter taste of regret and exhaustion. Muster calls on deck were hushed, grim ceremonies. Eyes, bloodshot and ringed with sleeplessness, scanned the tired faces, many unshaven and gaunt, reflecting not the vigor of men refreshed, but the profound depletion of men drained dry by the port's relentless grasp. The ship's clerk, his voice flat, called out names. Each silence that followed spoke volumes more than any eulogy. "Blackbeard, Sam?" No answer. Just a faint, sad ripple through the ranks. "Irish Jake?" A weary shrug from a nearby sailor, his gaze fixed on the grimy deck. "Old Man Jenkins?" A quiet murmur about a brawl, perhaps. Or more likely, the relentless grip of a fever caught in a squalid room, his body left for the scavengers or the city's anonymous burial pits. These missing crewmates were not mourned with tears, but with a hard, knowing silence. They were the land's silent casualties, consumed by its cheap pleasures, its insidious illnesses, its debtors' prisons, or its dark, unforgiving alleys. Each absence tightened the knot of unspoken fear and vulnerability in those who remained, a stark reminder of the port's true cost. The final return to the ship was a slow, heavy procession. The gangplank, once a bridge to a promised paradise, now felt like a stark, inescapable path back to a cage. Yet it was a known cage, its bars familiar, its routines etched into their very bones. As their worn boots hit the scarred planks of the deck, the overwhelming stench of bilge and tar, that deep, resinous tang of a working vessel, asserted itself. It pushed back the city's mingled miasma of refuse, stale ale, unwashed bodies, and cloying perfumes. It was not pleasant, no, but it was real, honest, and familiar. It was the scent of their lives. Orders, sharp and without sentiment, cracked through the morning air. Sails, heavy with dew, were unfurled with aching arms. Anchors, begrudgingly, were weighed, pulling free from the muddy seabed. The rhythmic groan and creak of the ship's timbers, a sound once monotonous and maddening, now felt like a familiar, reassuring heartbeat beneath their feet. The gentle, incessant sway of the deck, at first still disorienting after weeks of deceptive solidity, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to re-establish itself as the natural state of their existence. It promised no easy comfort, but at least a known challenge, a predictable adversary. The taste of brackish ship's water, always a bitter reminder of deprivation, was now merely the taste of survival, and in its stark clarity, almost a relief from the saccharine deceit of port liquor. As the vessel, groaning under its burden of weary men and renewed purpose, pulled away from the bustling, deceitful docks, the cacophony of the port began to recede. The shouts of dock hands, the distant music from taverns, the shrill cries of street vendors, all softened, blurring into an indistinct hum. The distant, plaintive cries of gulls, an age-old maritime lament, were the final auditory link to the land they were leaving behind. They stood at the weathered rail, some gazing back with a lingering, almost pathetic longing for what they had briefly held and irrevocably lost. Others, a grim majority, watched with a profound, almost bone-deep sense of relief, their eyes already turning eastward, westward, northward, southward. Anywhere but back. The ramshackle taverns, the teeming, treacherous streets, the fleeting promises and insidious perils of the port all began to shrink, fading into indistinguishable smudges against the ever-widening canvas of the horizon. It was a strange, undeniable sense of leaving one danger for another. But this new danger was vast, open, and at least straightforward. There were no false smiles on the high seas, no hidden blades in the dark. Only the relentless wind, the unforgiving waves, and the enemy, whether man or storm, clearly in sight.